Okay, good morning. It's a pleasure to be learning with you all again as part of our Springsman at Drisha. And welcome to Rabbi Silber's shir on the Book of Exodus, Reclaiming the Past and Building the Future. As usual, I will be inviting everyone to be a panelist. That means that we'll be able to see each other's faces. When we pause for questions, you'll be able to unmute yourself and ask. Um, in between those pauses, if you have any questions, you can put them into the chat here on Zoom or on Facebook Live, and I'll make sure that they get to Rabbi Silber. Um, and of course, when you're not speaking, please stay muted. I will be sending out those invitations to be a panelist again once we get started. And I will turn it over to Rabbi Silber.
Thank you. Okay, so we're in the book of Shemot. We're towards the end of the second chapter. I don't remember exactly where we left off last week, but I'll just pick up with Moshe is forced to run away from Egypt, directly or indirectly a function of the fact that he had killed an Egyptian who was beating up on one of the Hebrew slaves, and someone's talking about it, maybe from the fact that in the next instance, next story, when the two Jews are fighting, and one of them says to Moshe, when Moshe tries to break it up, he says, "You're going to kill me the way you killed the Egyptian." So Moshe realizes, and the Chumash says, the matter is known, and the next pasuk says, so one way or the other, we can say that people are talking about it, and they shouldn't be talking about it. Paro hears and wants to kill Moshe. Moshe runs away to Midian. And in Midian, when he comes to Midian, he goes to a well, and there he meets the daughters of the Kohen, the priest of Midian, whose name is Reuel. And the daughters are waiting to fill their, to get the water for the animals, and the other shepherds chase them away, and Moshe saves them. Moshe and he gives the flock water to drink. And then we have, they go home to their father, who says, "Why are you home so early?" And, an Egyptian man saved us. At which point he says, why do you abandon him? Invite him to eat with us. Kiren lo v'yochal lochem. That's the 20th verse of the second chapter. And the next pasuk is Vayol Moshe l'shevet eto ish. Moshe agreed to stay with the man. Vayitenu et Tzipora b'tola Moshe, and he gave his daughter Tzipora to Moshe. So here we have a marriage story once again at the well. So now we have 3 marriage stories at the well, and each marriage is based on something else. The first marriage, Rivka and Yitzchak, is based on the qualities, character of Rivka. The servant is searching for a woman who is kind, welcomes strangers, and Rivka is the one who immediately comes out and gives him to drink and gives his camels, and that becomes the basis of that marriage. That's back in chapter 24 of Breshit, and then you have the second story. That's the story of Yaakov and Rachel. It's chapter 29. Yaakov is also running away from. Yaakov runs away from his home. He's going to Aram, and he's also searching for a wife. And he meets Rachel at the well. And when he sees Rachel at the well, he gets the water from the well, and he gives her flock to takes care of her flock. And he also cries and he kisses her. It's a very emotional meeting. And the Torah tells us that Yaakov loves Rachel. And that's the basis of that marriage. Yaakov loves Rachel and works many years for Rachel to obtain her in marriage. So that the basis of that marriage is love. That's marriage number 2, also at the well. And now we have Moshe coming to the well. But the basis of this marriage is not the qualities, the character of the daughters of Midian, because actually they don't have any, as far as the text is concerned, they neither, first of all, don't do anything for Moshe. He helps them, he even saves them it says, Vayoshian. And furthermore, they don't even invite him home. They don't say, thank you, come with us. They simply ignore him. And so that's the basis of this. So what's the basis of the third marriage? So the basis of marriage number 3 is Vayo Moshe Washevet et Ish. Moshe agreed to stay with the man. I think this is as far as we got last time. Vayitenet Tzipora B'Tol Moshe. He gives his daughter Tzipora to Moshe as a wife. So here we have marriage number 3 of the well. And the basis of this marriage is it's not about the woman, actually. It's about her father. Moshe agrees to stay with the man, and staying with the man means connecting to the man. And Moshe connects to this man, who is the priest of Midian. He connects to him, or a priest of Midian in any event, and he gives him his daughter to Moshe. So that's the way of Moshe connecting to this priest. And the other way he connects, apart from getting the daughter, invite him to eat with us, to break bread. Lechem doesn't always mean bread, but it means food. But eating together is not, eating is not always just simply a biological act. There's also a social dimension to eating in general. And in particular, when two people break bread, it's kind of making a treaty or an alliance. Over here, the way that Yitro, I call him Yitro, here he's called Reuel, cements his relationship to Moshe is through the lechem and by giving him his daughter as a wife. That's the basis for the marriage. It's not a love story, nor are there any particular qualities that these women exhibit. First of all, there's 7 of them. So it's certainly not a love story. There's 7 at the same time. And furthermore, they don't even invite him home. As Reuel says, why did you abandon the fellow? In the 20th pasuk, invite him to eat bread. So Moshe, though, has found a home, as it were. And the last pasuk of this section, and that we'll start with verse 22, Vatelet ben, Vayikra Shemo Gershom. So she gave birth to a child, son, and he named him Gershom. So actually Moshe gives the name over here. In the Torah, sometimes the woman gives the name, sometimes the man gives the name. Here it's Moshe giving the name. And Moshe names this child Gershom, Ki Omar, for he said, Ger hayiti b'eretz nachuyah. Here they translate, I have been a stranger in a foreign land. So the question is, what does I have been mean? In other words, what land is being referred to over here? There are 2 possibilities. One is that he might be saying, when I first came to Midian, I was a stranger, and now I feel I'm at home in Midian. That's a possibility. But I don't think in this case that's the best reading of it. I think the better reading is, I was a stranger in the land I was in. That is to say, I was a stranger in Egypt. Even though I was raised by Pharaoh's daughter, I don't feel that was my place. Now in Midian, now I have my father-in-law, the priest. I have a child. I have a wife. You know, I'm here. I'm okay. But looking back at my life, at the land of Egypt, I feel I was a ger. And just to repeat something that I've mentioned many times, and we'll pick up with the next few verses. Of course, we know that the covenantal formula in the book of Bereshit is Gerut Avdut and Inui. That's what in chapter 15, the covenant, Brit Ben HaBetarim. So God promised Abraham a descendant and a land. And Abraham said to God in chapter 15, Bama Eida Ki Roshena, Bama, through what will I know? That is to say, what is our commitment? Your commitment is to give us a land. What is our commitment? It's a covenant, 2 sides. What is our commitment? And God's answer was, Yodoa Teda, you should know. Ki you should know, that's the beginning of the covenant, that terms that your commitment is your descendants will be strangers. Avodim, they'll be slaves. They'll be subjected to inui, some kind of abuse. Those are the 3 terms. And what's interesting is that these 3 terms come together in the Torah several times. But one of the places they come together is right here. Because we all remember that in chapter 1, It says that Paro appointed taskmasters, Luman Anoto B'Sivlotam, to oppress them with their hard labor. Anoto B'Sivlotam. And so you have, and it also says after that verse in the first chapter, Vayavidu Mitzrayim et Bnei Yisrael b'farech, Vayimaru et Chayehem ba'avodah kasha, Chomer levinim avodah b'asada avodotam, Asher avdu b'hem b'farech. 5 times the root ayin bet dalet. So we have twice inui, and right afterwards 5 times avodah. That's vavodum v'inuotam. So in chapter 1, the Torah describes the situation of the Jews, the Israelites in the land of Egypt, under the new Pharaoh, as Avdut and Inui, which are 2 of the 3 covenantal terms. But what's missing in chapter 1 is the word ger. Now we know the Al-Gerim, they're strangers in the land, but the word ger did not appear. And where the word ger does appear is right over here at the end of the 2nd chapter. Moshe named his son Gershom, for he said, I was a ger in a foreign land. Ger hayiti b'eretz nachriya. So as it were, one can say that the fulfillment of Israel's part of the covenant. In other words, there's 2 sides to the covenant. There's God's promise that God will both punish those that enslave us. That's also in the covenant. And we're going to leave with a lot of wealth. And then the main promise is returning to the land, coming into the land that God will give us. So, but it's 2 sides. So our commitment, one might say that if we did our side of the bargain, the Gabriel, the Abdut, and the Inui, then God must fulfill God's part of the bargain. So here one could say, well, this is it. You have Avdut and Inui in chapter 1, and you have Gerut in chapter 2. Now, one could, of course, make the counter argument. One might say, well, you don't really have it. You have Avdut and Inui in chapter 1. That's true. But you have Gerut in chapter 2. You have Gerut in terms of one person. Moshe named his son Gershom, for he said, I have been a stranger in a foreign land. Ger hayiti b'eretz nachriya. Now the question is, does Moshe's sense of being a ger count to, does that count for all of the people? So we'll see in the Torah that whether it does count or not. It does actually count. But in any event, you have here the Abdut, and it's interesting, just to repeat something that I said earlier, it's very interesting that the order of the 3, there are 3 terms. This is sort of very basic. This is like very central to understanding what's going on here. The 3 terms in the covenant, God said to Abraham that to enter into this covenant, you need 3 things. The commitment on your side is threefold. Being a stranger, a ger, that's first. Second, a slave, avadum. And third, inui, oppression, maltreatment, abuse. Inui often is sexual, not always, but often. So over here, what do we have here in the story of the Exodus? In chapter 1, we had inui and avdut in that order. First inui and then avdut, and we had discussed this in the past. The 2 terms are switched. In the covenant in chapter 15, where the covenant is stated, it's gerut, avdut, and inui. But over here, in this fulfillment of the covenant on the level of the nation at the beginning of Exodus, you have inui, avdut, and gerut is third. So to repeat what we had, what I said earlier, some time back, that actually the gerut in the description of the covenant is first, but in the fulfillment of the covenant is last. And the way we can understand this is this, that actually in the description of what's going to happen, you will be strangers, you'll be marginalized, you'll be enslaved and oppressed. At the point of the Chumash is that once you marginalize people, it's very easy to oppress and enslave them. So in terms of from a sort of a logical standpoint, the first thing would be gerut, to be a foreigner, to be a stranger. And then what follows very often is avdut and inui. That's how it's presented back in chapter 15. But over here, when it's being realized, it's different. The Idui and Abdu are first. The abuse, the enslavement comes. But the recognition that you're a stranger, in other words, the recognition that you're a ger, the understanding you are not part of society, that often comes last. I know it sounds odd to say that someone who was beaten and enslaved doesn't already know that he or she is a ger, but the fact of the matter is, we often don't. And over here, in the story over here, where the one who says, I was a ger, which is Moshe, he always says it after he leaves Egypt. And this is actually true equally in the book of in Bereshit with Yaakov. Yaakov says in Lavan Garti, which is the third of the triad, in chapter 32, only after he leaves the house of Lavan, he looks back at it and he says that wasn't my place. And we all know this to be true. Because very often we're in situations, whatever it may be, personal life, business, but when you're in it and you're suffering, but you don't really fully realize, how damaging it is. But once you leave, you leave a job, you leave a relationship, you leave it, you look back at it, and you say, Garti, you say, that was never for me. But when we're in it, we often don't realize it. So in terms of the recognition, often the gay word comes last, and it comes once you leave, as we have it both with Yaakov and with Moshe. In ger ayiti, I was a ger. It wasn't my place. That's what Jacob says. I was 20 years in the house of love, and now that I've left, I look back. That's not for me. The whole value system, the buying and the selling, everybody's a commodity. I can't live that way. That's only once he leaves. It's a process. It's a process of record. It takes a lot of time, but at the end of it, we look looking back. He says in Lavan Garti, and the same thing is true of Moshe. So here, anyway, the important point for us is, first of all, that Moshe does have a sense. He realizes that he's a stranger. It's not his place. But the actually very important point is that the story of the Exodus is a covenantal fulfillment. I've said many times that I have, my Haggadah, both in Hebrew and English. I claim essentially, I don't know if it's actually written this way, and I don't remember anymore, but the point of that, one of the main points of the Haggadah that I wrote is to make it clear that the covenant is at the center of the Passover Haggadah. That the Passover Haggadah makes the claim, which is the claim of the Torah, that the Exodus from Egypt is clinching a covenant which already has been formulated much earlier in the time of Abraham. And it's not just a historical event, but it's covenantal event. That is to say, it actually is a description of what it means to be a Jew. Actually, it means to enter into this covenant, and that the covenant is clinched, as it were, through the experience of the Exodus. Because this is the relationship in which we live, for better and worse. But this is who we are. That is the point of the Passover Haggadah, which is probably the core ritual of the Jewish people. And that is the key point. You live, it's a long-term relationship. There's ups and downs and all that. But this is the relationship in which we function. And it's taken from the Torah. It's very simple. It's very straightforward. And when Moshe says ger hayiti, the reader asks the question, well, does this count for everybody? Maybe it's just one person. Maybe Moshe realizes it. But Moshe's recognition doesn't count, as it were, for the Jewish people. But we see in the continuation of the story that it actually does count. And that's the next couple of psukim, which I'll take care of, then I'll stop for comments and questions. So let's continue. Now we're up to verse number 23 of chapter 2, towards the end. Vahi bayamim harabim ahem. In those many days. Vayamot melech Mitzrayim. So the king of Egypt dies. Vayeonchu b'nei Yisrael min ha'avoda vayizaku. Batal shavatam Elohim min ha'avoda. So a long time after that, here's a long time after that, or in those many days, whatever, king of Egypt dies. That new pharaoh has died. And the Israelites, it says, were groaning, to groaning or sighing under the bondage, mino avoda, from the slavery. And they cried out, and their cries ascended to God from the slavery, min ha'avoda. Now this is a very interesting pasuk for a couple of reasons. First, I'll say the more obvious one, then I'll say something that's not obvious at all. Actually, from this verse, it's not obvious, but it will become quite obvious. The first point is a very important point. The cries, Israel was groaning, they translate groaning from the labor. That's their translation. By Ye'anchu anacha, it's like sighing or groaning. But when do they sigh and groan? When the king of Egypt dies. And this is the point, I think, one of the points that this Torah is making here, and this is so true. It's similar to what I said before. When sometimes when you're a slave, you go out every day and who knows what, you're working in the fields, and you work and you work and you work. And the fact of the matter is that on some level, of course, it's terrible. I mean, it's terrible objectively, but actually, as long as you keep on working, you're in that situation, it's very hard to evaluate your present situation. But if you stop working, if you just stop for a while, that gives you the time to come to a recognition of really how bad it is. And that's what you have over here. The king of Egypt dies. Presumably, the moment he dies, there's perhaps some kind of a stoppage before the new king takes over or whatever. And in that period of time, after the king of Egypt dies, there's when you stop working, then they groan or sigh from the slavery, and then their cries ascend to heaven from the slavery. I would add to this that later in the story, chapter 5, that's when Moshe goes to Paro and at God's command. And Moshe will say to Paro, listen, we Hebrews want to have a 3-day journey, take a 3-day journey to the desert. You have to serve our God. Our God has appeared to us and demands that we serve God, bring sacrifices. We can't do them in Egypt. Give us an opportunity to go to the desert. And Paro refuses. And Paro says to Moshe, what would you do? There's so many of you. Tashabitu, you would cause this multitude to stop working. Tashabitu, you give them Shabbos. That's not going to happen. And he makes the work more difficult. He takes away the straw. The last thing in the world that Paro wants is a Shabbat. He doesn't want Shabbat. Because the moment you have a Shabbat, you're not working. And the moment you stop working, you start thinking. You could actually evaluate. And that's the last thing this guy wants, is for people to come to some kind of recognition that maybe you don't have to work all the time. Maybe you need breaks. So Shabbat is a pause or a day of rest that could potentially, for Paro, be a disaster, because people then will begin to think and to evaluate and to come to a recognition of the situation. That's point number one. I think that's obvious anyway to me. But the point is, let me get to point number two, which is not obvious. And it's a wonderful little touch in this verse. And that's the following. I mentioned, and I've mentioned this so many times in the past, that the experience of Egypt is a fulfillment of the covenantal promise that God made to Abraham back in chapter 15 of Breshit, called the Brit Ben Habitarim. And what's interesting is you see how precise the Torah is about this. We have already taken note of the fact that here you have the Gebut, the Abdut, and the Inui, not in that order. But we have all three components, okay? What's interesting is, if you have a Tanakh, you can see in chapter 15, when Abraham asked the question, what do we have to do to enter into the covenant? How will we know? Or through what shall we know? And God's answer is Yodoa Teda. You will certainly know. Back in chapter 15 of Breshit. This is pasuk number 13 of chapter 15. Vayomri Avram Yodoa Teda ki yezaracha b'eretz lohem v'avadum v'inu ot Abraham yod shana. Know well, your descendants will be strangers in a foreign land, enslaved, abused, 400 years. And then the next verse number 14, this is chapter 15 of Breshit, verse 14, and the nation Asher Ya'avodu, that enslaves them, Don Anochi, I will judge. And what's interesting is, God says, first of all, they're going to suffer for 400 years, but I'm going to judge the nation. The nation that enslaves them, I will judge. And what's interesting is that, coming back to our verse, right? In those many years, the king of Egypt died. Israel grows from the mino avodah, from the slavery, and they cry out. And their cries ascend to God, mino avodah, from the slavery. Notice that in verse 23, what the Torah singles out, it doesn't say from the Inui. It says from the avodah, from the slavery. Because actually, back in chapter 15, when God speaks about God's intervention, I will judge those that enslave them. And here we have 2 times in this verse, mino avoda, from the slavery, which is very interesting because in chapter 1, the ayin bet daled word appeared 5 times. And now we have 2 more for a total of 7, which is very typical in the Torah. And what you expect next is, as God said to Abraham in the covenantal section, I will judge those that enslave them. And now, in the very next verses, lo and behold, God is suddenly hearing our cries. We've been there for dozens, maybe 200 years. But now God hears the cries, and now God will set out to keep God's word, to fulfill the promise that God made to Abraham in the covenantal section. And that's the next verse. Vayishma Elohim et na'akatam. God heard their moaning. Vayiskar Elohim et rito, and God remembered the covenant et Abraham et Yitzchak v'et Yaakov that God had made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. True, the formulation of the covenant was only with Abraham, but clearly Yitzchak and Yaakov were chosen as the covenantal children. It's Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. So now suddenly God remembers the covenant. What covenant? Covenant of chapter 15. On that day, God made a covenant with Abraham, which is passed down to Isaac, which passed down to Jacob. So it's very precise, actually. Exactly what God had said. They're going to suffer Gerut Abdul Inui, then the nation that enslaves them, I will judge. Now, God is remembering God's covenant. It means that we should expect over the next time, short time, long time, for God to visit punishments upon those that enslave them. That's going to be the 10 plagues. That's going to be God's intervention. It's all been predicted, and predicted in the most precise way. So fine. So in this verse number 24, we're told 2 things. First of all, that God hears the cries. Secondly, the important verb that God remembers God's covenant with Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And the last verse, and I'll stop and take comments or questions. Vayar Elohim, God saw Bnei Israel. Vayeda Elohim. Here they translate Vayeda, which means God knew, that God took notice of them. In point of fact, the verb to know is a key word in the book of Exodus. It might be the key word in the book of Exodus. And I've come to believe it's even more so the key word in the book of Genesis, which really begins with the tree of knowledge. But anyway, I'm not going to get into all that. But my point is, Vayeda Elohim is more than just intellectual knowing. Of course, God knows. But knowledge over here is different. It's more like, it has to do more with caring. Like his sister stood from afar, to know what would happen to him. It's more than just to know. She's centrally involved. She's connected to that story. She's going to rush down and say to Pharaoh's daughter, can I find you a Hebrew nursing woman? So the verb to know in this book, and certainly in the book of Breshit, is much more than just intellectual knowledge. It has multiple meanings, but I'm recalling the verse that we had in Bereshit in chapter 18 when God said to Abraham, I can't conceal from you what I plan to do to Sodom. Ki Yidativ, Abraham is so special. I know him. And I know him. Of course, he knows. Of course, God knows. But Yidativ is more. I care about him. I've chosen him. It can be any range of meanings. Anyway, over here, I'll stop in 1 second. We have 4 verbs about God. Suddenly, Israel is crying out after Moshe said, I am a stranger, Gerut. And now God is responding, and there are 4 verbs. God is hearing. God is remembering, covenant. That's in verse number 24. And the final verse of the chapter, God sees and God knows. We're going to pick up with these 4 verbs in a couple of minutes. But before that, let me just stop here for a moment and take some comments or questions. If there are any comments or questions, I welcome them. Yes. In the chat or speak up, whatever.
Rabbi, you can just supplementing what you said. There is this sequence: Vayishma, Vayiskor, Vayar, Vayeda. So that the intensity of the connection is pictured in the words.
Okay, I agree with Vayeda. Vayeda is to be deeply connected. That's Vayeda. Vayeda is also used sexually in the Torah. It means to connect in a very profound way. And God is doing that over here, as we will see in the very next section, which is going to play with these verbs, as we will see. These verbs are very important for us. Actually, as we will see, they're actually critical, I think, in understanding what's going to happen. And the Torah sets this up very, very nicely for us. I agree. Good point. Certainly, Vayeda is the significant, but Vayiskar is also suddenly God remembers. Why now? Like I suggest, because we've done our part of the bargain. Now God is going to keep God's part of the bargain, right? Anybody else for a comment?
Earlier, Deborah Kaufman put in the chat, maybe Ger implies you belong somewhere else. Oppression makes it difficult to think of oneself with dignity, but the Ger has another place to aspire to.
Yeah, I was just going to explicit that question. When you mentioned that Moses has this, awareness all of a sudden, and he's not a slave, by the way. So
right.
he can think of himself as, I don't belong here, I don't belong there, I must belong somewhere else. And so all of a sudden there's a plan, and he needs to find his place. And I guess that it's harder for slaves to come up with that idea. They forgot where they even came from. But Moses doesn't really know where he comes from. It's interesting. He has no sense. He's completely uprooted. Philosophically, spiritually.
I'm not sure that he thinks. In other words, he certainly knows that Egypt is not his place. That's for sure. The question is, does he know at this point in his life that Midian is not his place? Yes. I don't think so. I think he's actually very happy in Midian.
Yes.
Which is why he doesn't want to leave. When God's about to say to him, leave Midian and save the Jews, and Moshe, I would say, has zero interest in doing that. He has a million excuses why he doesn't want to do it. But when you have give many different reasons about something, very often, none of them are the real reason. If you give one reason, maybe it's the real reason, but he has several. And at the end of the day, he will turn to God and say, listen, get somebody else, which means he doesn't want to go.
Yeah, I don't want to do yeah.
Right. So, but I will come back to your point about having a sense of certainly that you didn't have a place, but we'll encounter this later on about what Moshe thinks about Midian. And Moshe does leave Midian, okay, because God told him to. And one of the interesting questions is how Moshe understands that experience. There's no question, as we will see shortly, that this priest of Midian is very close to Moshe. Interesting, by the way, just to point something out, which we'll pick up on several times later, that the story of Moshe does seem to parallel in this respect the story of Yosef, because Yosef goes to Mitzrayim, and he is married. He marries the daughter of a priest of Egypt, whose name is Potiphar, or Potiphera. He marries Osnat bat Potiphera, Kohen On. Yosef in Mitzrayim is connected to the priesthood, to the priestly family, apparently a very important priest, whose name is Potiphera. So in that sense, they're similar. Of course, Moshe is going to, I'm not saying that Reuel or Yitro is the same as Potiphera. They're very different. But it's interesting to take note of that, because the parallels of Moshe and Yosef are very important in this book, and we'll touch upon it again. Anybody else for a comment or question? If not, we'll just continue to begin chapter 3.
Yeah, there was one more. Neva
ahead.
Hellman put in the
Yes.
chat the connection with Bereshit 15:13, which I just pulled up, and it's very striking. Just 1 second, it's loading. 13 there, Vayomer LaAvraham, Yadua Teda Kiger, Yehezer Achabaret Lo Lahem.
Right. That's the verse that I read before.
Yeah.
Where God spells out the covenantal process. And yes, that the word over there, of course, the key word of Bereshit, probably of Shemot as well, is to know. Because Avram had said, Bama Eda, how will I know? And God's response is, Yodoa Teda, you will certainly know. And this is what you will know. Avram is not doubting God, I think, over here. I don't think that. Avram is saying, through what? Not how will I know. How, but through what? Bama. And God says, Yodoa Teda, know very well. And this is my plan. And it's God's plan. We can question the plan, but this is the plan of suffering for many years. And as I've said in the past multiple times, it's even more complicated than that, because the way it's set up in Bereshit chapter 15, it's about 4 generations, 3 generations of slavery, and the 4th generation returns to the land. But the 3 generations are represented by the animals that are cut in half, and the 4th generation by the birds that are not cut in half. So the birds are going to sort of fly to freedom. But the point is that the 3 generations of suffering are not the same as those that fly to freedom. So if you're one of the generations of suffering, your suffering is in order that your descendants will be able to possess the land. It's a very powerful idea. In any event, that is the key verse over here, chapter 15, verse 13, and really the key verse, Yodoa Teda. Yes, I touched upon that before. Okay, so we that's as far as that was beginning at the 3rd chapter, which is a very famous chapter, of course, the story of the burning bush, and God's interfacing with Moshe, and God commanding Moshe to go to Egypt to save the people, and Moshe's initial refusal to do so. So let us begin now. Okay, here we go. Moshe hayaroeh son Yitro chokno Kohen Midyan. Vayirhag atzon achar midbar. Vayavo char Elohim choreva. First verse is first of all, the first thing we notice in chapter 3, verse 1, is that this, presumably, it's his father-in-law, but his father-in-law is named Yitro. In the previous section, he had a different name, Reuel, and over here he's called Yitro. Now, to me, it sounds like it's actually the same person. I don't think he has 2 fathers-in-law over here. You only know of 1 wife. So the person in chapter 2, at the end of chapter 2, is the same person at the beginning of chapter 3. Not 2 different people. The same person with 2 names. The names are not names. Because Reuel, in chapter 2, probably means God's friend. Areya is a friend. So, so this is the friend of God. In chapter 2, the priest is called the friend of God. But in chapter 3, he's called Yitro. Now, what does Yitro mean? That's the question. Very important question, because the names are signifiers. They're not random names. So the word Yitro, Yeter, Yitro, probably in modern Hebrew, it's the same word, miyutar. What does miyutar mean in modern Hebrew? It means superfluous or extra. So chapter 3 tells us that Moshe is working for his father-in-law Yitro at very first verse. This is a person who will become extraneous or superfluous or added baggage, extra. Miyutar means in modern Hebrew, it's more than enough. In other words, it's something which is not needed. It's miyutar, unnecessary. And that very name itself, before you get to the story, and Moshe works for him too. He's not just married to his daughter and eats at his table, but he works for him. He's a shepherd. Says the Torah in the very first verse, without setting up a certain expectation, Moshe is going to have to leave this guy. And it's not going to be simple because Moshe this is Moshe's one and only friend, but you have to leave him. Moshe is going to have to leave because he has a different task in the world. His task is to save the Jewish people, as we'll see how the Torah sets that up, which is very interesting. So he has a job, he has a wife, he has a kid, he's got his set. But he leads the flock, he drives the flock into the wilderness. Chorev, by the way, means wilderness, emptiness, Chorev. But Chorev in the Bible is a synonym for Sinai. It's a synonym for Sinai. The book of Deuteronomy, Dvarim, when it refers to Sinai, it always calls it Chorev. So over here, he comes to the mountain of God. Who knows what the mountain of God is? But it could be Har Sinai. That makes total sense because Chorev is Sinai. So let's say he's standing at Har Sinai right now, minding his own business, watching the flock, and suddenly his life's about to change. Because in the second verse, so an angel of God appeared to him out of a fire, out of a sneh. Sneh was a low, maybe a bush, a lowly plant of the desert. That's a sneh. And of course, we know that the mountain that he's at, Har Chorev, is also Har Sinai. The mountain of God in Chorev is Har Sinai. He's standing at Har Sinai. Now, how he got to Har Sinai, why he got to Har Sinai, the Torah doesn't say. Is it just an accident? Guys take wherever the sheep go, or wherever the flock is, he follows them? Or can we even suggest that in some way, perhaps even unconscious to Moshe, something is drawing him there? I think both interpretations are possible, but there's certainly no sense that Moshe knows very much about God. He does know about justice, because he's been involved in 3 different cases in short order in chapter 2. But God, who knows what he knows? In any event, he finds himself at the mountain, and suddenly an angel appears, it says, from amidst the fire. And behold, and this bush is burning, but the bush was not consumed, which is remarkable. And Moshe is interested in this. Moshe's intellectual curiosity. In the Chumash, the whole Chumash, he has the most intellectual curiosity. Vayom Moshe, I want to see this amazing thing. Let me draw close. I'll leave my place, I'll draw close and see this. It's incredible. Why does the fire not go out? This violates what he learned in science or something in 6th grade or whatever. I mean, it's problematic. Why isn't the bush consumed? That's intellectual curiosity. And one more verse. Vayera Hashem Kisara, when God saw that he had come near to see. God called out from the bush. Vayomer Moshe, Vayomer Hineni. Moshe calls out God, and Moshe answers Hineni. The word Hineni we know to be it's a good example. It's a very innocent word, Hineni. It means here I am. Hine ani. It's a contraction. But words function in the text differently than they function when you're just talking like that. Because certain words in stories, they are positioned in a certain way. And we know that when Moshe says Hineni, God calls Moshe Moshe, this is of great significance. We have two other examples of that in the Torah, two that preceded this one, the burning bush. One is when Yaakov goes down to Egypt in chapter 46. The last time God spoke, God said, Yaakov, Yaakov, and Yaakov said, Hineni. That's in chapter 46. And of course, the other story of the binding of Isaac, Akedat Yitzchak, Avraham, Vayomer Hineni. So we have that same thing, the double use of the name and the response of Hineni. We have at the Akedah. We have Hineni more than once at the Akedah, actually. And the other is Jacob's descent into Egypt. One could clearly say that the Hineni has appeared in those two cases at actually pivotal, if not the most pivotal points in the whole book. Descending into Egypt, that's a pivotal moment. The binding of Isaac, one of the great stories of the Torah, and the culmination of Abraham's life. So when God says, Moshe, Moshe, the double Moshe, Vayomer Hineni, we know we're about to hear something of great significance. Okay, let me just say one other point over here about the story, about the snare, and then I'll stop and take comments or questions, and then we'll finish up. The point is this. When you have something like a snare, a little fire, a snare is a lowly bush. You have something that's burning, but it's not consumed. And the question we ask, of course, is, what does that signify? And it can signify more than one thing. There are a lot of different midrashim about the snare, but the point I want to emphasize is there are a lot of possibilities, but there's one possibility to me that stands out above all others. And that is that what the fire represents is God's presence. At Mount Sinai later, there'll be the great fire. It means God is very present. In this story, God isn't very present. God is present for just one person, just to Moshe. And it's a little fire. It's in a snare, but it doesn't go out. And the question is, what does this signify? So what I have claimed in the past, and I'll repeat it, is this. What the fire signifies is the presence of God. God is speaking. God's going to talk. And the reader says, gee, I wonder what the last time God spoke was. And the last time God spoke, of course, was when Yaakov was going down to Egypt in chapter 46. And God said, Yaakov, Yaakov, Hineni. And God said, don't be afraid to go down to Egypt. I'm going to be with you. I'm going to bring you out. And then all that's when Yaakov is going down to Egypt. But this time, this is the next time God speaks. And the fact of the matter is that all these years in Mitzrayim, God does not speak. It's almost definitional. To be in Egypt means to be in a place where God doesn't speak. To be in exile means to be in a place where God doesn't speak. In the Chumash, it's Mitzrayim, by definition. You're in Mitzrayim, God is not talking to you. God is going to speak now in Mitzrayim, but that's to say, get out. But all this while, what's in definition? What does it mean to be in exile? To be in a place where God doesn't speak. That's the story over here. Now, as some of us have studied in the past, it's not true only of Egypt. Egypt is a geographical space. It's also a set of values. It's a cultural space. It's a religious space, etc. But in point of fact, there's another story which is based on the story over here, and that's not about Mitzrayim, because you could be in exile even in the Holy of Holies, because if God is not talking, you're in exile. That, of course, is the story of the calling of Samuel, of Shmuel, in the 3rd chapter of Shmuel, which begins with all the same language. In those days, vision was scarce. That's how chapter 3 of Shmuel begins. The eyes of Eli, the high priest, had become dim. He could not see. That's sentence number 2. And the candle of God was not yet extinguished. And Samuel was sleeping in the holy place in which the ark is found. And God called out to Samuel. That's how that story begins. It's Shmuel being parallel to Moshe. But we're not talking about Mitzrayim in that story, not the geographical Mitzrayim. You're talking about the spiritual Mitzrayim. You could be in the Holy of Holies, and you could be in exile. That's the point of that story. It's a terrific chapter, and it's based on the chapter over here with all kinds of interesting variants, interesting plays off the story. In any event, God is calling Moshe. God is revealing God to Moshe. At Chorev, which is also Sinai. Notice that the text calls the place both Chorev, but also Sinai, because God will speak from the Sneh. Sneh, of course, and Sinai are related, but it's also Chorev, which is a place of desolation. Moshe is in a desolate place. He somehow ended up there, as I said, either by just accident, or maybe something unconsciously draws him there. That is possible. But God is going to take the initiative and speak to Moshe. Let me take one more verse, and then I'll stop and take comments or questions. Yeah. So let's take one more. God speaks to Moshe and says, "Vayomer al tikrav halom." The first thing God says is, "Don't get too close." Shalom li'alecha me'al raglecha, take off your shoes. Ki hamokom asher ata omeid alav admat kodeshu. For the place that you are standing is holy soil, holy ground. In other words, what makes something a holy ground here is the fact that God is speaking. Right? 20 minutes ago, it wasn't holy ground. It's holy ground specifically because it's a ground in which God speaks. So here we have, in a sense, Moshe has wandered into God's holy place. And the first thing is to take off your shoes. You're standing on holy ground, which is interesting in general. Being in the holy space requires certain kind of behaviors that normally you don't have. But this is the holy space. It's Admat Kodesh. It's a holy space. And this will prefigure Mount Sinai, of course. It probably is Mount Sinai. But here it's a little bush, a snap. Later on, and a small fire. Later will be the great fire of Sinai. Let me just stop here for a moment to take comments or questions, and we will continue. Plenty of time. Anybody have comments or questions? Anything in the chat? Nothing there?
Rabbi, do we know anything more about the root connection between Sinai and Sneh, like what the meaning of the root is?
I'd have to look that up. I really don't know.
Okay, thank you.
Sneh's like a little bush, maybe a cactus or something like that.
Right.
It's very interesting, by the way, that in the Midrash, there's a lot of discussion about Har Sinai. It talks about Har Sinai as being not the tallest mountain, maybe a low mountain. It talks about the Torah being given not on the highest mountain. In other words, the Torah requires a certain humility and a certain self-effacement, humility. So the Midrash talks about the fact that the Torah was given on a low mountain. As one of my teachers once said about the Torah and respecting the Torah, the teacher said, well, it was given on a low mountain, but it was given on a mountain. That's what he said, So it's not, it's anyway, but that's, so the sneh is a bush, and that's what a sneh is. So again, I can't say more. I'll take a look and see. It's interesting that the desert that they wanted to was Midbar Sin. It's also related to Sinai. The Sin, the Sinai, and the sneh, and they're all connected to each other. Let me take, yes.
Rabbi, is there any other place where God starts speaking as a surprise, with a suddenness? Before Yaakov became aware of God's presence on his own, he was in a dream. He slowly worked his way into it. But is there any meaning to this, that there is this sudden appearance of God surprising the person?
There's certainly meaning to it. I mean, I think that, what I said before was that in a certain sense, God has to speak now. In other words, whether people are whether Moshe is ready for it or not. And obviously, he's not ready for this because he resisted for about a chapter and a half. But the point I made earlier was that Israel has, in fact, fulfilled their terms of the covenant. And immediately God's going to respond. But it's certainly true that Moshe is for sure not ready for this particular revelation, nor does he have much of an interest in it. So for a chapter and a half, you have other sort of, I would say, surprising revelations. I would say the revelation to Abraham in Parshat Lech Lecha is very surprising, because the Torah told us nothing about Abraham, except that he's 75 years old. There's absolutely no intimation whatsoever that God will speak to Abraham. So that is certainly something which is, unusual, remarkable, I would say. As you said, the story of Yaakov, the dream, it's in a dream when he wakes up, he's very frightened. And that's really the beginning of his spiritual journey, is that dream in chapter 28. But it's certainly the case. And what we have over here, by the way, just since you mentioned it, we have God calling Moshe. Moshe will resist. But that, what's called in Hebrew, a haktasha, a calling, sanctification, a calling, this you have in other places too. You have in the book of Jeremiah. God calls Jeremiah, says, "Who am I? Why are you calling me?" You have the story you have the story in Isaiah chapter 6, where God summons Isaiah for the mission, and he says, he's surprised about that. He's not ready for it. So that theme of the prophet who is unready, that you have with Yirmiyahu and you have with Yeshayahu. You have those two places as well, which is not surprising. A part of that has to do with typically the prophet who's being called, not just not ready is one possibility, but also being a prophet is not a simple matter. Because the prophet has one main job, and Moshe has more than one, but the prophet has the main thing the prophet's got to do. And that's very dangerous in this world. The prophet has to speak the truth. And people don't want to hear the truth. Sometimes people say, "Tell me the truth. I want to hear it. I want to hear it." My experience is the people want to hear and want to hear, typically resent it after you tell them. People often came to me, and they still do. They think I'm going to tell them the truth, which I try to do. How they take it, they're not always so happy to hear it. You know what I mean? So the fact is, and prophet it's a dangerous job. Some of the prophets were almost killed. Some are killed. And you're talking to power also, typically, especially the way the prophet. They talk to the kings. So it's not a simple task. But that is a theme that in this chapter, a general theme that is picked up throughout the Bible, the calling of the prophet. And this is the first great calling of the prophet. Now, before we get to the next verse, I want to say one thing, though, about this story. Moshe will resist, have a million responses, get somebody else, and all this. But what is curious over here, or interesting, is that in the first verse, number 4, Moshe, Vayomer Hineni, and Hineni, the way it functions in the text, I am here. Let's say in the case of the Akedah, Avram, Vayomer Hineni, means I'm here and I will do whatever you want. So that Moshe does say in the very beginning. Hineni means I'm present. But the way it often functions, or has functioned, is I'm present to do your bidding. So even though he's going to resist, but we, the reader, understand at the end of the day, he's going to do it. Because in a sense, he's made that commitment. Let me take another verse over here, which is verse number 5, very important verse for our purposes. So now God is speaking. Up to now, it's just the introductions. Moshe, yes, take off your shoes, you're in a holy place. And now we have in verse 5, very, very important pasuk for our purposes. Vayomer, God speaks. Anochi Elohei Avicha, I am the God of your father. Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Vayafseh Moshe panav. Moshe hid his face. Ki yorei me'abit Elohim. He was frightened to look at God, Elohim. Right. So this is God is speaking, but it's not the mission yet. God is introducing God to Moshe. Who I am? I'm the God of your father, the God of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. This is who's speaking to you. God of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And here, Here is something very, very important about how God introduces God. The first point being, God says, I am the God of your father. And I think what this means, I'm the God of your father, that is to say, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In other words, who is Moshe's father? Well, Moshe's father is Amram. We know this later on. We know a man from the house of Levi took a woman from the house of Levi. I don't think that's what God's saying over here. In point of fact, in the story of Moshe's birth, it's all about the women. It's Pharaoh's daughter, it's his natural mother, and there's Miriam, his older sister, functionally like a mother figure. When I say two mothers and one mother figure, who helped Moshe, who saved Moshe, and then bring him back to Pharaoh's daughter. But there's no father in the story. And now God says to Moshe, I'm the God of your father. That is to say, let me tell you who your father is. Your father is Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We call them the Avot. And the point I would make, to pick up what I said earlier, what is unique about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? This trio, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, what is unique about these three? So in the book of Bereshit, what's unique about these three as a group, that all three of them pray, they all pray to God, and to all three of them, God responds. These are people who pray and are responded to. These are people who have had revelation in their life, all three of them. After Yaakov, God doesn't speak. Joseph he may have revelations through dreams, but there's no prayers of Joseph. He never prays. And God doesn't reveal God to Yosef in any natural way. So when God says to Moshe, you are the son of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, this is your father, it carries with it the following significance. And God, in fact, is speaking to Moshe. That's what I mentioned before. God hasn't spoken for such a long time, since Jacob goes down to Egypt. But now God is talking. In that sense, Moshe is the spiritual son of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. That's one sense in which Moshe is the spiritual son of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. But there will be another more important sense which will come up later. But that's the first sense. In our prayers, we have the prayer of our Amidah, the core Jewish prayer. It begins with Elokeinu v'Elokei Avotenu, Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. So Moshe is the son of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Okay, let's take a couple more psukim over here. Want to scroll down there? Yeah. All right. Vayomer Hashem. Now, finally, God will now say to Moshe. So God is, by my point of the previous verses, it's not so much that God is introducing God to Moshe. It's equally more important that God is introducing Moshe to Moshe. Let me tell you who you are. You are Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob's son, spiritual son. Fine. Now we have the mission. Vayomer Hashem. Ra'o ra'iti et ani ami Hashem b'Mitzrayim. Says God. Ra'o ra'iti. The English translation is not precise. I have certainly seen the suffering of my people in Egypt. Ani. The first thing that God mentions is Inui. That's the first thing mentioned. And Inui, suffering, in biblical Hebrew, almost always, not always, but almost always takes the verb to see. I have seen the Inui in Egypt, in Mitzrayim. And I've heard their cries of those that oppress them, the cries of the oppressed. I know their sufferings, I know their pain. This is verse number 7. Did you notice something very interesting about this verse? Very interesting, extremely interesting, actually. I noticed this many years ago, and this got me in a good path. Had a good thought, put me on a good path. You see what it is here? It's very interesting. I'll tell you what it is. This verse number 7, has 3 verbs. Let's see which 3 it's got. First, it has the verb to see. Ra'o ra'iti. I've certainly seen the abuse, the suffering of the people. That's number 1. Then there's verse number 2. Verb number 2. Verb number 2 is etzakatam shamati. I have heard their cries. That's verb number 2. And then verb number 3 at the end, Ki yodati et machalav. I know their pain. I know their pain. So what is interesting about this verse is that we have three verbs. We have to see, we have to hear, and we have to know. So what is interesting here? So what's interesting is that in this section, the section we read before, where it talks about God hearing the cries, it says the king of Egypt died, and the people cried out from their labors, and the cries ascended to heaven. And God heard their cries. God remembered the covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the next verse, God saw the children of Israel. Vayeda Elohim, and God knew. Vayeda Elohim, God knew. What's missing in this verse? You have 3 verbs, but there's a missing verb. The intro to it was what God hears and remembers and sees and knows.
Remembers.
Remembering is missing. It doesn't say the remembering. And that is a very, very significant point. And we, the readers, when you see this, you say to yourself, why would it, where is the remembering over here? And we're waiting for the remembering, and it's not going to come for a while, but it will appear, and it will appear in a different place. Not in chapter 3 at all, not in chapter 4, not in chapter 5. It appears in chapter 6, where God will say to Moshe in chapter 6, for Eskoret Briti, I remember my covenant. Exactly what it said before. God remembers the covenant. Those exact words appear in chapter 6. They do not appear over here. I didn't want to say why they appear in chapter 6. We'll have to read for a while. But the fact that they don't appear here, I want to comment on that. But let me just read one more verse. And I want to talk about why remembering is not here. So now God says this. Here's what. For a raid uhatzilo miyad Mitzrayim ulahaloto min haaretz hahi. God says, I will come to save them. I will go down, a raid. I will go down to save them from Egypt and to bring them up from this land. El Eretz Tova Urechava. I want to bring them to a good and broad land. El Eretz Avat Chalav Udvash, a land of milk and honey. El Makom HaKna'ani v'Achiti v'Amori, HaPrizi Achivi v'Hayebusi, in the land of these 6 nations, and the Torah and the Torah lists the nations. That's God's plan. Okay, and God will continue. Now, and the time I'm going to do this right now, I want you to do it. Fine. But let's just stay for a moment on verse number 8. First of all, just a couple of quick comments about verse number 8. Number 1, that the verbs that God plans to go down and then to bring them up, for a raid and lahaloto, is precisely what God said to Jacob in chapter 46, the last time God speaks, when God said, I'm going to go down with you, Anochi a raid imcha mitzrayma, v'anochi alcha gamalo, and I will bring you up. So to go down, up and down, that was the last time God speaks. In fact, the last time God speaks to Yaakov, I'm the God of your father. It's exactly the same speech, actually. 46, when Yaakov goes down, and the snare are parallel speeches. Fine. That's one point. But here the point, I want to make a different point over here. The mission that God describes to Moshe. Namely, what is the mission? What is the point over here? I'm going to take them out of Mitzrayim, right? And bring them to a good and broad land. Eretz Tova Urechava. In Birkat HaMazon, you have that expression in the second blessing, right? No Hashem Elokeinu al shenchaltu lavotenu Eretz Chemda Tova Urechava. V'al she'otzeitanu Mitzrayim. There you have exactly those 2 things. I'm going to bring them to a broad land, right? I'm going to take them out of Mitzrayim. The point about Mitzrayim, here you see that Mitzrayim from the word tsar. Tsar means narrow. The Hasidic text will talk about Mitzrayim as a narrow space. But it's actually the Torah. I'm going to take them out of Mitzrayim and bring them to a good and broad land, a land with milk and honey, a land where powerful nations live. So the description over here, Moshe, your job is what? What is Moshe's job in this verse? Is to take a suffering people that are being abused, the people that live in a space, or narrow spaces, and to bring them to a broad land, and a land which has a bountiful land, milk and honey, and powerful people live there. You have the good life there. In other words, the point over here, essentially, in this verse, this is Moshe's mission, his charge, is to take him out of a narrow place, a place of suffering, and to bring these people, these slaves, to a better place. And the point over here, no mention of confidence. God appeals to Moshe in chapter 3 to the Moshe that we have already experienced in chapter 2. What do we know about Moshe in chapter 2? We know one thing. This is a guy who cares about the underprivileged, who cares about the people that are being beaten up. And it doesn't seem to matter to him one way or the other who it is. Because the first story is the Egyptian beating the Jew, and he takes action. He sees no one else is doing anything, or he thinks nobody's going to catch him, whatever it is, and he kills the Egyptian, the one who's beating the other one. In the second story, two Jews are fighting. He said to the wicked one, why would you hit your friend? Right? So again, there's two Jews. One's beating the other one. So the guy who's doing the beatings, he says, stop it, what is this? Don't do this, it's not right. And the third story is two non-Jews. He runs off to Midian. He sees these women being pushed around by the men, which apparently happens all the time, because when they come home, Yitro says, why are you home so early? Happens all the time, and he's not going to stand for that. Who asked him? He's a guy on the run himself, but it doesn't matter. And the last time he tried to break something up is the reason he has to flee for his life. Doesn't seem to stop this fellow. So he says he saves them. If that's the word the Torah uses, he saves them. Moshe is a man who's concerned about the suffering, when I say the underprivileged, the marginalized, etc. So God appeals to Moshe. Listen, I'm going to go down. I see the slaves. They're in narrow spaces. I want them to have a better life, a good and broad land, milk and honey. You know what I mean? And Moshe can understand that. But apparently, there's something that God does not say, which is, I remember my covenant, because apparently Moshe can't understand that yet. Something has to happen to Moshe to allow him to understand. So the point is, it's an educational point, actually. You want people to understand what you're saying. So, when you're teaching, whether it's in this kind of a setting or a good school, the point is, you don't want to say things that are obvious. That's boring. You don't want to say things that people can't possibly understand. That's just frustrating. What you want to do in education is you want to put students in a space where it's not easy. But if they work, they can do it. And that's what God is doing over here. God is teaching Moshe, but God is addressed. It's not a simple task, and Moshe is going to refuse initially to do it. In the end, to agree. But the way the task is described is the suffering people. Moshe is concerned about social justice, okay? Social justice, I'll give you the opportunity. Go down to Mitzrayim, take out the slaves, and bring them to a good place. That's God speaking to Moshe in chapter 3 at the step. And then God says, I'm going to, this is my task, but I want you to represent me. I want you to represent me. That's how that's how the story of the step begins in any event. And we'll have to continue next time with the chapter, and then we'll get more into the details of the back and forth. Moshe's excuses for not going, which I say are excuses. Not that the excuse is necessarily false, but Moshe is negotiating. I do want to make one last point, just give me another minute here, which is this. Here it's a kind of negotiation. Now, Moshe has the advantage in this negotiation, I believe. So God pursues Moshe. But remember, the only thing, we know one thing about Moshe, which is, and we began with this this morning, it's the afternoon, we know that Moshe understands that Egypt was not his place. Gershom, Gera Yiti B'Eretz Nachriya. We don't know what anybody else thinks, but we know that Moshe said in the naming of his child, that wasn't my place. Egypt is not a place for me. I don't share their values. I don't share their outlook. So this is the person, and Moshe also has in 3 different occasions shown that he's willing to intervene to help people. We don't know if anybody else knows that they are a ger. So Moshe has a certain advantage. God wants someone to do God's work, but as far as we can tell, there's only one candidate here. So Moshe has the advantage in the negotiation. There's nobody else to go to, and Moshe will extract from God in this negotiation 2 big concessions that we'll see. This is the art of negotiating. In any event, so next week we'll pick this up and we'll try to go more quickly through these psukim in terms of the back and forth between Moshe and God in terms of Moshe's willingness or readiness to take on this mission. All right, I'll stop over here. If people have more questions, you can always email me. It's dsilber@drisha.org. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Silber. Thank you, everyone, for being part of our learning community at Drisha. Looking forward to seeing you again next week. In the meantime, there are plenty of great shiurim coming up as part of Drisha's Junesman. I will put the link in the chat. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Good weekend. Bye.